The frost on the windows thickened as night fell over Reykjavik, encasing our small house in icy isolation. Christmas was just days away, but the usual cheer felt muted this year. The streets were quiet, the snow heavy, and the cold seemed deeper, biting in a way that felt personal. I arrived home late that evening, arms heavy with bags of gifts for my family. The familiar warmth of the living room beckoned, but as I approached the front door, I noticed it, a small package dusted with snow, sitting on the welcome mat. There was no return address, no markings of any kind, except for a rough twine bow holding the brown paper together. My husband, Eric, leaned against the doorframe, his breath misting in the cold. "Special delivery?" he joked, reaching to take it from me. "Was it here when you got home?" I asked. He shook his head. "Haven't seen it before. Looks harmless enough." Inside, I peeled away the paper, revealing a slim, leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked and faded, with an intricate design etched into the surface. A monstrous feline, its teeth bared, its eyes unnervingly lifelike, even in illustration. Below the image, words in Icelandic read, "The Yule cat waits." Eric laughed when I showed him. "A bit late for Halloween, don't you think?" he teased. "Probably some old folklore nonsense. Leave it to Icelanders to scare kids into being good for Christmas." I wasn't amused. Beneath the book was a slip of yellowed parchment. The handwriting was jagged, like it had been scrawled in haste. "Beware the Yule cat. All who forget will pay the price." I felt a shiver, one I couldn't blame on the cold. Eric rolled his eyes. "Don't tell me you believe this." "No," I said, but my voice betrayed me. I slid the book and note into a drawer and tried to push the unease aside. The night pressed on, and the world outside felt heavier than usual. The snow had begun to fall in thick, silent waves, casting a strange glow through the living room window. Eric and the kids, Anna and Leif, were sprawled on the couch, half watching a Christmas special, while I busied myself with wrapping gifts. The steady rhythm of scissors slicing through paper calmed me, until I glanced outside. In the fresh snow on the driveway were tracks, not the neat, rounded imprints of boots or the scattered scuffle of stray dogs. These were enormous paw prints, deep and deliberate, leading from the edge of the woods toward the house. My heart skipped. "Eric," I called softly. He joined me by the window, his brow furrowing. "Could be a stray cat," he said, but we both knew no cat made tracks that size. We double-checked the locks before bed, my unease settling like lead in my stomach. But Eric's calm laughter followed me. "Don't let a silly story ruin Christmas," he said, pulling me close. Still, that night I dreamed of glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. The first sin was the tree. It was mid-morning when I noticed something was wrong. The Christmas tree in our living room, decorated with handmade ornaments and glimmering lights, was leaning slightly to one side. The garland hung loose, and the glass angel on top was shattered on the floor. I frowned, kneeling to clean up the shards. "Did the cat get in here?" I muttered to myself, but our cat, Kisa, was sound asleep on Anna's bed upstairs. The air felt colder by the tree, as if the window nearby had been left open, but it hadn't. Eric found me staring at the mess and chuckled. "Maybe the kids got too excited. It's just a tree." But the unease was growing. By the next evening, the tracks had returned. This time, they circled the house. Eric saw them too, his usual skepticism faltering. "Must be a fox," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I didn't point out that fox tracks didn't look like this. These were larger, heavier, as if something immense had prowled the property overnight. Anna claimed she saw something watching her from the edge of the woods, a figure with glowing eyes. Eric dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination. "It's Christmas. She's probably been watching too many movies." But I remembered the note, The Yule cat waits. The nights became heavier, and the house seemed quieter in a way that felt wrong. Kisa began to act strangely, avoiding windows and hissing at empty corners of the room. On the third night, I woke to the sound of low, rhythmic purring, deep enough to rumble in my chest. At first, I thought it was Kisa, but the noise came from outside, circling the house like a predator. I stood at the window, my breath fogging the glass. At first, I saw only the snow-covered yard, still and blanketed under moonlight. Then I noticed the tracks again, this time leading directly to the front steps. My stomach turned. That morning, a neighbor stopped by with a warning. Old Sigurdur had lived in Reykjavik his entire life, and his face was as weathered as the mountains. "You know about the Yule cat, don't you?" he asked. I forced a laugh, pretending not to care. "New clothes," he said simply. "Every family member must receive something new to wear before Christmas, or the Yule cat will come." His expression darkened. "It feeds on those who forget." When I told Eric, he laughed it off. "Superstitious nonsense," he said. "I'm not buying into this." But the tracks kept coming. The shadows kept shifting, and in the quiet hours of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something enormous and hungry was watching us. The tree was completely destroyed by the morning of Christmas Eve. Eric was the first to notice, letting out a frustrated exclamation as he walked into the living room. The branches were shredded, the ornaments smashed into glittering fragments scattered across the carpet. Even the strings of lights were torn and twisted into gnarled knots, as though some unseen force had ripped them apart. "Did Kisa do this?" he muttered, but we both knew the answer before the words left his mouth. "She doesn't have claws like this," I said, pointing to the deep gouges raked across the wooden floorboards beneath the tree. Eric's face paled slightly, but he shook it off, grabbing a broom. "Probably raccoons," he said, though there was no conviction in his voice. That afternoon, the unease simmering between us boiled over. Eric went outside to check on the property, muttering about finding the damn raccoon once and for all. I busied myself with cleaning, trying to ignore the rising tension in my chest. But it was Anna's scream that shattered the fragile calm. I rushed upstairs, my heart pounding, and found her standing at her bedroom window, her face pale. She pointed to the edge of the woods. "There," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's watching." I followed her gaze and felt my blood turn cold. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the branches swaying in the wind. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. A hulking figure crouched just beyond the tree line, its massive frame partially obscured by the swirling snow. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, fixed unblinkingly on our house. It didn't move. "It's just your imagination," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. I pulled Anna away from the window and closed the curtains, my hands trembling. When Eric came back inside, his face was set with frustration. "The tracks go everywhere," he said, pacing back and forth in the kitchen. "Around the house, to the woods, then back again. They're too big for a fox or a raccoon. But what else could it be?" I didn't answer. Instead, I showed him the note from the package again, the jagged handwriting warning us of the Yule cat's wrath. Eric snorted, though his unease was evident. "This is ridiculous," he said, crumpling the paper. "It's folklore, a story to scare kids into behaving. We're not buying into this nonsense." But his bravado faltered when the purring began again that night. It was louder this time, deeper and more guttural, resonating through the walls like the growl of a massive engine. Kisa was nowhere to be found, but the sound circled the house, moving from window to window. I sat on the couch, clutching Anna and Leif close, while Eric stood by the front door, gripping the fireplace poker. "Stay here," he said finally, his voice tight. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. "I'm going to scare it off," he said, pulling on his coat. "No," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "You don't understand what this is. It's not an animal, Eric. It's something else." He shook me off gently but firmly. "We're not going to let some stupid myth ruin our Christmas," he said, and with that, he stepped outside. The cold swallowed him instantly, the door slamming shut behind him. I held the children tighter, my heart racing as I listened for any sign of struggle. Minutes passed in agonizing silence, punctuated only by the distant sound of purring. Then the screaming began. Eric's voice tore through the stillness, raw and panicked. I bolted to the door, flinging it open to find him stumbling toward the house, his face pale with terror. He shoved past me into the foyer, slamming the door shut and bolting it behind him. "What happened?" I demanded, but he only shook his head, his breathing ragged. "I saw it," he said finally, his voice trembling. "It's real. It's huge. Those eyes." He trailed off, staring blankly ahead as if reliving the moment. I led him to the couch, forcing him to sit while I fetched a blanket. His hands were ice cold, and his eyes darted nervously to the windows. That night, the house felt like a prison. The air was heavy, oppressive, and every creak of the floorboards sent us into a panic. The purring continued, a low, menacing rumble that refused to fade. As midnight approached, I remembered the words of our neighbor, Sigurdur. "New clothes for every family member, or the Yule cat will come." I clutched the book from the package, its illustration of the monstrous feline glaring back at me. Had we brought this upon ourselves? The answer seemed painfully clear. The Yule cat was here, and it was hungry. The snow outside was stained crimson. I found it the next morning, a thick trail of blood stretching from the edge of our property into the woods. Eric refused to let me follow it, insisting we focus on keeping the kids safe, but the sight burned into my mind. Whatever the Yule cat had claimed during the night, it wasn't finished. By evening, the house felt alive with fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the winter wind sent us flinching. Eric barricaded the doors and windows with furniture, while Anna and Leif sat silently in the corner, their small bodies trembling under a pile of blankets. "What do we do?" I whispered to Eric. My voice sounded foreign, fragile in the stillness. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he gripped the fireplace poker. "We wait. It can't stay forever." But we both knew the truth. The Yule cat wasn't leaving, not without its prize. As the hours dragged on, the purring began again. It started softly, almost imperceptible, like a vibration threading through the air. Then it grew louder, resonating through the walls and filling every corner of the house with its ominous hum. Kisa, our cat, had disappeared entirely. Eric hadn't mentioned it, but I saw the way his eyes flicked nervously toward her usual spots, the empty windowsills and chairs. When the knock came, it was almost a relief, a sharp, deliberate rapping at the front door that shattered the tension like glass. Eric and I froze, staring at each other in wide-eyed disbelief. Who could that be?" I asked, but the answer came before the words left my lips. The knocking continued, louder now, each strike reverberating through the house. Then it stopped, replaced by the sound of something enormous scratching at the door. "It's testing us," Eric said, his voice low. I stood, unable to stay frozen any longer. "I have to stop this. We can't keep waiting. It's not going to go away." Eric grabbed my arm, his eyes wild. "You're not going out there." But I had already decided. The note, the book, Sigurdur's warning. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The Yule cat wasn't just hunting us. It was punishing us for our neglect. I pulled free from Eric's grip and moved toward the drawer where the book was hidden. The yellowed pages felt heavier than before, the illustration of the monstrous feline seeming to glare at me. At the back of the book, in spidery handwriting, was a single passage. To confront the Yule cat is to risk everything. A sacrifice may be demanded. Enter only if you are prepared to give what you hold most dear. I have to go, I said, the words trembling in the air. No, Eric hissed, his hand gripping my shoulder. You're not going anywhere. We'll wait for morning. Maybe it'll leave. It won't, I replied, pulling away. We've seen what it does, Eric. If we don't stop it, we'll lose more than a Christmas tree. I grabbed a flashlight, ignoring Eric's protests, and pulled on my coat. Anna's wide, tear-filled eyes met mine as I opened the door. Mommy, don't, she whispered, but I forced a smile I didn't feel. I'll be back soon, I said, closing the door behind me. The woods were silent, the snow crunching beneath my boots, the only sound. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the bloody trail that snaked deeper into the trees. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood, and every step felt like a betrayal of my instincts, screaming at me to turn back. The purring grew louder as I neared the clearing. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It surrounded me, vibrating in my chest like the growl of an approaching storm. Then I saw it. The Yule cat loomed in the center of the clearing, its massive form blending with the shadows. Its fur was black as coal, its eyes glowing a malevolent yellow that pierced the darkness. Its tail lashed the snow, carving deep grooves as it watched me approach. "Why are you here?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The beast's lips peeled back in a grotesque mockery of a grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Its voice, when it came, was a guttural snarl, ancient and cruel. "You forgot the old ways," it rumbled. "You failed to honor the season. Now I will take what is owed." The blood trail led to a small, motionless shape behind the cat. My heart seized as I recognized Leif's coat. "No!" I screamed, stepping forward, but the cat's growl stopped me in my tracks. "Give me what you hold most dear," it said, its eyes narrowing. "Or he is mine." My breath caught, the weight of its demand crashing down on me. Sacrifice. That's what the book had warned about. I couldn't fight it, couldn't reason with it. All I could do was offer something in return. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered the answer. "Take me instead." The Yule cat tilted its head, studying me for what felt like an eternity. Then it stepped aside, revealing Leif's shivering form. It let out a final, deafening roar before vanishing into the shadows, leaving only the echo of its purring behind. The woods were silent after the Yule cat vanished. I dropped to my knees in the snow, pulling Leif into my arms. He was trembling, his face pale, but he was alive. Relief coursed through me like a flood, though it was tempered by the knowledge of what I had done. "Mom?" Leif's voice was weak, barely audible over the rush of blood pounding in my ears. "I'm here," I whispered, stroking his frostbitten cheeks. "You're safe now." But were we? The clearing felt wrong, as though the Yule cat's presence had seeped into the ground, tainting the air and snow. I forced myself to my feet, cradling Leif, and staggered back toward the house. Each step through the forest was like walking through a dream or a nightmare. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the edges of the path. When we reached the house, Eric threw the door open, his face pale with worry. He pulled us inside, locking the door behind us as though that could keep the darkness at bay. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice shaking. I couldn't answer. My words felt trapped, swallowed by the weight of what I'd seen. Eric hugged us both tightly, but his relief was short-lived. The children, silent in their corner, stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "You're bleeding," Anna said softly. I glanced down. My coat was soaked, but it wasn't my blood. The crimson stains spread from my sleeves to my hands, the warmth seeping into my skin like a curse. "Go upstairs," Eric told the children, his voice tight. "Now." Once they were gone, he turned to me, his expression filled with fear. "What did you do?" I offered myself," I said, my voice trembling. "It let Leaf go, but—" I trailed off, the memory of the Yule cat's eyes burning in my mind. It had accepted my offer, or so I thought. The way it vanished hadn't felt like resolution. It felt like retreat. The night dragged on, oppressive and endless. We tried to sleep, but the house felt alive with tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, set us on edge. When the clock struck midnight, the purring began again. This time, it was louder than ever, vibrating through the walls like the growl of a feral beast. Eric gripped the poker tightly, his knuckles white, but neither of us moved. We sat frozen in the living room, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that the Yule cat had returned. It didn't take long. The scratching began at the windows first, a slow, deliberate scraping that moved from one pane to the next. Then came the sound of something heavy pacing on the roof, the thuds reverberating through the house. "It's still here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Eric didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the front door, where a new sound had begun, a low, rhythmic knocking, as though something massive was testing the wood. The purring grew louder until it was deafening, filling every corner of the house with its dark resonance. Eric stood, his grip on the poker tightening. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm despite the terror in his eyes. "Don't," I begged, grabbing his arm. "You can't fight it." But before he could respond, the knocking stopped. The purring faded, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. For a moment, we sat in the stillness, waiting for something to happen. Then came the final sound, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was followed by a loud crash, as though something immense had slammed into the side of the house. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging us into darkness. Eric grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the windows. Frost crept along the glass in jagged patterns, spreading like skeletal fingers. The temperature in the room plummeted, our breath visible in the dim beam of the flashlight. Then, we saw it. The front door was covered in claw marks, deep and precise, carved into the wood with terrifying precision. At the center of the door, burned into the surface, was a symbol, the silhouette of a cat with glowing eyes, its mouth open in a silent snarl. I staggered back, my legs trembling. Eric stood frozen, his flashlight shaking. "It's a warning," I whispered. "It let us go, but it won't forget." We huddled in the living room for the rest of the night, the darkness pressing in around us. The purring never returned, but the house felt haunted, every shadow a reminder of what had come for us. When dawn finally broke, the frost melted, and the world outside seemed normal again. But we knew better. The Yule cat wasn't gone. It was waiting. As we packed to leave, a final note slipped through the mail slot. The words, scrawled in jagged handwriting, chilled me to my core. "Traditions forgotten cannot be forgiven." Even now, I hear it sometimes, the low purring, the scratching at the edges of my dreams. It's a sound that tells me the Yule cat is still out there, watching, waiting.